So welcome back for the second session of our conference. I'm very happy to introduce the chair of the session, Aileen Feng, who's Associate Professor at the University of Arizona, though she's here in Florence this year at ITATI as Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fellow. Aileen received her PhD in Italian Studies at Berkeley in 2008, and she's published a considerable amount since. She's the co-editor with Falkheid, who's here with us now, of Rethinking Gaspare Stampa in the Canon of Renaissance Poetry, which came out with Routledge in 2015. She's co-translator with Fabian Alfie of Burchiello's poetry, which is quite a heroic achievement, I'm sure you'd all agree. The poetry of Burchiello, deep-fried nouns, hunchbacked pumpkins, and other nonsense. Her first monograph writing, Beloveds, Humanist Petrarchism and the Politics of Gender, came out with the University of Toronto Press in 2017, and she's currently working on her second monograph, Feminism's First Paradox, Female Misogyny and Homosociality in Early Modern Italy, which she gave a very interesting lecture out of for the same series, the Acton Lectures, last fall.
And thank you, Virginia, for inviting me to share this very exciting panel on widowhood. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the first speaker, who's Falkheid. As Virginia mentioned, we co-edited a volume of criticism together, so it's always really lovely to see each other and to hear new work. Received her PhD in Italian Studies from the University of Oslo in 2006 and is currently the chair of the Norwegian Renaissance Society. And she's also Associate Professor of History of Ideas at University of Oslo. Her first book on Petrarch came out in Norwegian in 2006, and her monograph, The Avignon Papacy, Contested an Intellectual History from Dante to Catherine of Siena, is coming out at the end of the summer with Harvard University Press. She's also the editor of Dante, A Critical Reappraisal, as well as the co-editor with Albert Astley of the Cambridge Companion to Petrarch. And today she will be talking to us about a sort of pre-model for Vittoria Colonna and widowhood.
It's a great honor to be here, to see friends again, and to visit this fabulous villa, and to take part in this conference on Vittoria Colonna. So I have to come with an apology, because my paper is, in fact, not on Vittoria Colonna. However, Anna Wainwright, and who is following me in this session here, and we have just initiated a broad interdisciplinary research project entitled The Legacy of Birgitta Sweden, Women, Politics and Reform in Renaissance Italy. And one of the main figures in this project will, of course, be Vittoria Colonna. By tracing networks connected to the production of the many manuscripts and print editions in courts, cities, convents, and publishing houses of Birgitta's literary corpus, we plan to investigate how Renaissance and early modern female writers may have fashioned their authorial voice on Birgitta of Sweden's revelations. A particular focus will be on the political discourses during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, from Vittoria Colonna to Queen Christine of Sweden. And I have just the last weeks worked eagerly to finish this proposal. So this is in fact the very first presentation of our project for public. So my paper here will be on the founding figure in this project, namely of Birgitta of Sweden. So let me jump into it. By the end of 1349, just before the opening of the Holy Jubilee, of the Holy Year of the Jubilee in Rome, proclaimed by Pope Clement VI, a widow of high rank and great ambitions was entering Rome. In the sources, Birgitta, as you understand her name was, is sometimes called the Principessa, a princess from the Kingdom of Sweden, with close links to the Swedish-Norwegian royal family. Together with her husband, Ulf Gudmarsson, to whom she gave birth to 8 children, she had undertaken pilgrimages to Nidaros in Norway and to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. For those of you who don't know Birgitta, She supposedly received hundreds of revelations during her lifetime, which were gathered in her voluminous Liber Celestis Revelationes, Celestial Book of Revelations. The 8 books are recently published in English for the very first time by Oxford University Press. So together with Catherine of Siena's collection of letters and her book Dialogo della Divina Provvidenza, Birgitta's Revelation is by far the most extensive literary production by any female author in the late Middle Ages. And both women also came to play major roles in the political and ecclesiastical debates in the Italian Trecento. Some years after her husband's death, Birgitta embarked on a new journey, a journey from which she never would return. She left Sweden in the fall of 1349. She was about 46 years old then, and she traveled through Europe, where she had a longish stay in Milan as a guest of the Archbishop and Signore Giovanni Visconti, the current ruler of Milan, before she entered Rome in December, just in time before the Holy Jubilee initiated. Before she left her home country, Birgitta had obviously been full of expectations for a forthcoming encounter with Rome, the city of St. Peter and St. Paul, and the holy institutional center of Christianity. As her presence in Rome had supposedly been foretold in one of her revelations, only a year before, in that great city, she would experience marvelous things. Vade Romam, Christ supposedly told her. Go to Rome, where the streets are paved with gold and reddened with the blood of saints, and where there is a shortcut, that is, a shorter way to heaven because of the indulgences that the holy pontiffs have merited because of the prayers. Moreover, you are to stay there until you see the supreme pontiff and the emperor there at the same time in Rome, and you shall announce my words to them. To your information, neither the Pope nor the emperor lived in Rome when she arrived. Since 1309, the Pope and the Roman Curia resided in the city of Avignon in Provence, in southern France, while the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire stayed in Germany. As we see in this quotation, however, according to Birgitta's Christ, she could expect the return of both in Rome. That is indeed the aim of her journey. Moreover, Christ emphasizes the sacredness of Rome. The city was a sanctified place where the course of time had been able to create a shortcut, a brevior via, between heaven and earth. However, the actual meeting with Rome turned out to be a disappointment. It was not at all as foreshadowed by her visions from Sweden. Soon after her arrival, she wrote a letter dated 1350, which clearly expresses her frustrations. The text is designed as a letter rather than a revelation. It is addressed to anonymous prelate, and Birgitta opens it with a most unusual salutation. Honorable Father, I, a widow, declare that many very amazing revelations were made to a certain woman while she resided in her homeland. After having been submitted to the diligent examination of bishops and learned religious priests, these revelations were shown to have come from the holy and miraculous enlightenment of the Holy Spirit and from no other source. Even the king and queen of the realm acknowledged this on the basis of credible proof. Moreover, the same woman journeyed abroad to the city of Rome, where, when praying one day in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore, she was caught up in a spiritual vision, while her body seemed to fall into a torpor, though not a torpor of sleep. Described here is a fundamental feature of Birgitta's visions. It is received in a state of rapture, but while still awake. Moreover, the question underlines the reliability of her revelations. By referring to the process of discretio spiritum, which she went through in the 1340s in Sweden, she underlines the truthfulness of her visions in general and of the specific revelation she is now going to describe to the reader. The following revelation takes place in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, in which the Virgin comes to Birgitta, commanding her to send a message to the prelate, which we may assume is Pope Clement VI. The Virgin powerfully describes the poor state of the church. I would have him, the prelate, to know that the foundation of the Holy Church is so heavily deteriorated on its right side that its vaulted roof has many cracks at the top, and that this causes the stones to fall so dangerously that many of those who pass beneath it lose their lives. Several of the columns that should be standing erect are almost level with the ground, and even the floor is so full of holes that blind people entering there take dangerous falls. Sometimes it even happens that, along with their blind, people with good eyesight have bad falls because of dangerous holes in the floor. Because of all this, the Church of God is tottering dangerously. The result of this will shortly be seen. I assure you that she will suffer a downfall if she does not receive the help of repairs. And her downfall will be so great that it will be heard throughout all of Christendom. All this is to be taken in a spiritual sense. The portrayal of the church in which Birgitta finds herself is consistent with other descriptions of the city of Rome from the same period. In this actual letter, however, the discrepancy between the glorious past and the miserable present is made glaring by the fact that the vision is received in Santa Maria Maggiore, the majestic church on the top of the Esquiline Hill, one of the major basilicas in Rome and the only one dedicated to the Virgin. We may assume that the many traces of the church's original beauty, such as the old mosaics, may have rendered the current states even more miserable in Birgitta's eyes. As Birgitta describes it, the basilica is now more or less in ruins, with toppled columns, cracks in the roof, and dangerous holes in the floor where visitors can easily stumble and fall. But it's not only Santa Maria Maggiore that is in such terrible shape. Virgin Mary emphasizes that she is speaking spiritually, which turns the actual basilica into an image of the Catholic Church in general. As Santa Maria Maggiore has become a most dangerous place for visitors, the Catholic Church in its current state leads people astray, yes, even to the perdition of the abyss, configured by the many potholes in the ground, rather than saving souls. Birgitta's prophetic voice, conveyed by Mary, subsequently break through. The current negligence may be fatal if the church does not receive the restoration needed, she says, and the collapse will resound throughout the Christian world. The physical and spiritual forms of corruption, in other words, reflect one another. And in the following, Mary hurls out her critique of the contemporary church and its depraved moral state. The church is in need of profound restoration, including the removal of the wicked priests who, I quote, lead a life of carnal debauchery and who are as insatiable as the ocean chasm is in the greed for money. Such men should not be promoted, but rejected in God's church, we read. The letter is exceptional in the way Birgitta refers to herself as a widow, ego vidua. In accordance with the calling vision, she usually presented herself as a bride of Christ, which was common for holy women in the late Middle Ages. But in the letter from Santa Maria Maggiore, Birgitta does not move within the bridal metaphor. Instead, she presents herself as a widow. In general, the letter exhibits a strange emphasis on female voices and female figures. The widow speaks of a woman, both refer to Birgitta, of course, who has received a revelation from the Virgin about the current state of the church, which is also portrayed as a woman. It is as if the entire social spectrum of feminine roles, the Virgin, the Mother, and the widow, are raising their voices within the trembling shelter of the basilica dedicated to the divine Theotokos, the Mother of God. As some scholars have argued, Birgitta's self-presentation as a widow may be modeled upon early saintly women who were married, such as the Beguine Marie d'Oigny and Elizabeth of Hungary. They both legitimated ways of performing piety in practice. So by imitating them, Birgitta could easily fashion her saintly widowhood and achieve a similar authority. There were other saintly women as well, such as Hildegard of Bingen and the Beguine Metzger of Magdeburg, unmarried though, but who produced substantial literary works, and for this reason may have been exemplary for Birgitta. Far less explored, however, and which may have been of great importance to Birgitta, especially after arrival in Italy, was the literary topos of the widowed Rome. In the contemporary historical context, the figure of the widow has political connotations that are intimately connected to the fallen Jerusalem and Rome as the New Jerusalem. My suggestion thus is that Birgitta's self-presentation may be connected to the widowed Rome, as depicted in contemporary literature of the 14th century. So let me please explain what I mean. Configurations of Rome as the widowed Jerusalem had been adopted earlier in the Middle Ages. Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance, powerfully used the image in his letter to the Roman people after the uprisings in 1145, when Pope Eugene III was driven from Rome into exile in Viterbo. The imagery of the widow was founded on the opening lines of the Book of Lamentations. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. Some lines later, a personified Jerusalem raises her voice. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is Annie's suffering like my suffering that was inflicted on me, that the Lord brought on me in the day of his first anger? In the Franciscan tradition of the 13th century, these verses were often transferred into the suffering of Christ on the cross, such as in Bonaventure's Vitis Mystica, or in John of Peckham's and later Petrus Johannes Olivis' commentaries on the Lamentations. The image of the widow of Rome was moreover reinforced by the losses of Jerusalem and by the final loss of the Holy Land in 1291. However, only when the representation of the widowed Rome was connected to the papacy's stay in Avignon in the 14th century was the rich potential of the image rediscovered. Early in Trecento, Dante constructed two of his political letters around the image of Rome as both bride and widow waiting for her husband to return to the tradition in the tradition of the Lamentations. We find the image in his Epistola 5 to the princes and people of Italy, and in Epistola 11 to the Italian cardinals. Moreover, the same image was used in Purgatorio 6, where Dante hurls out his long vituperation of the deplorable situation in Italy. Vieni a veder la tua Roma che piagne, vedova e sola, e di e notte chiama, Cesare mio, perché non m'accompagna? As we can see from these verses, Dante's configuration of a Rome mourning even has Christological allusions in the way it dramatically echoes the suffering man's last cry on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? No one used the image of the widow so powerfully, though, and with such immediate political implications as Petrarch did. In a metrical epistle, Epistola 2:5, addressed to Pope Clement VI, to whom Birgitta's letter also is directed, Petrarch appeals for the Pope's return to Rome. Through the rhetorical doctrine of the personificatio of the widowed Jerusalem, he let Rome herself present the case for the Pope. At the pontiff's feet, the city deplores her circumstances, urging her, supposed to hear her complaints and return home, lest her bride suffer a widowed old age. Petrarch's epistle was written in 1342 as a support of the delegation from Rome that was sent to Avignon with a plea to the newly elected Pope Clement VI that he should return to Italy. The delegation also asked the Pope to declare a jubilee to take place in Rome in 1350 in order to improve the city's poor economic situation caused by the loss of the rich papal court when it moved to Avignon, and by the constant feuds between the city's mighty barons, mostly the Orsini family and the Colonna family. An irony is that the dialectic imagery of widowed sorrow and nuptial joy was used by Pope Clement VI himself as one of his favorite motifs. The bridegroom who comes to meet his bride, the city of Rome. Clement, however, twisted this argument by putting more emphasis on the Pope's role as the universal pastor of the Ecclesia Romana than the Bishop of Rome, thereby discreetly underlining that his presence was not that urgent. Clement's argument was simply that ubi Papa, ibi Roma, where the Pope is, there is Rome. In contrast to this idea, Petrarch strongly stressed the function of the Pope as husband of the Church and the city of Rome as the mother of all nations. This epistle offers an appeal to the Pope to support the plea for a new jubilee, which was the mission of the Roman delegation. Rome ends her moving appeal to the pontiffs as follows: if her spouse cannot return, the many pilgrims who may gather in the city for such a jubilee will comfort her and mix her sorrow of the yearning mother for what she has lost with the joy of abundant offsprings. We have no evidence for that Birgitta knew Petrarch. If they ever met, it might have been through the Colonna family, with whom both Birgitta and Petrarch were closely connected. But the sources do not tell this. This is also, of course, an aspect which is highly interesting to explore regarding Vittoria Colonna. However, when Birgitta entered Rome as one of the many pilgrims in the year of the Holy Jubilee, the city was full of traces of the mourning widow. What had happened between Petrarch's epistle to Clement VI and Birgitta's letter to the same pope in 1350 was the revolution of Cola di Rienzo in 1347. Petrarch was not only a close friend of Cola. In contemporary sources, he is even depicted as the mind behind Cola's revolutionary program. In other words, Cola di Rienzo carried out in action what Petrarch, the poet in Avignon, had long speculated upon: the political and institutional restoration of Rome as caput mundi. The most astonishing with Cola's revolutionary program, well supported by Petrarch, was the commission of an enormous panel painting on the facade of the Senator's Palace on the Capitoline Hill. The contemporary historian Anonimo Romano vividly describes these paintings that unfortunately are lost. Cola admonished the rulers and the people with an image which he had painted on the palace of Campidoglio, or Capitol, in front of the market. On the outer wall, above the chamber, he had a picture painted of a tremendous sea with horrible waves storming violently. In its midst, a ship was foundering without rudder or sail. In the endangered ship was a widow woman, dressed in black, bound in a belt of mourning, her own ripped from her breast, her hair torn as if she would weep. She was kneeling, her hands piously crossed over her breast, as if praying to be saved from a danger. The inscription said, "Questa è Roma," this is Rome. Around the ship, in the lower part of the water, were four sunken ships, their sails fallen, masts broken, rudders lost. In each was a woman, sunken and dead. The first was named Babylon, the second Carthage, the third Troy, and the fourth Jerusalem. The inscription said, "Because of injustice, these cities were endangered and fell." Among the dead women, these words were written: "Once you held high dominion over all, now here we await your fall." Despite the absence of Cola and Petrarch from Birgitta's oeuvre, there may have been some influences. The picture commissioned by Cola of the widowed Rome must have been striking to the newly arrived Swedish widow, both in their size, their vivid colors, and their theatricality. The most conspicuous of them were the frescoes at the Senator's Palace at the Capitoline Hill, where Rome was, as we have seen, depicted as a mourning widow. Like this figure, and like Petrarch's metrical epistle that preceded it, Birgitta uses the rhetorical doctrine of the personificatio, ego vidua, and this even in one of her earliest letters, if not the first letter, from the Roman period. Moreover, similar to Cola and Petrarch's metaphorical program, Birgitta spins subtle threads between Rome and the New Jerusalem. In one of her most famous visions, also from the period just after her arrival, Birgitta clearly vents her frustrations through the voice of Mary. If all the gardens of the whole world were to be brought alongside Rome, Rome would certainly be as great as to the number of martyrs. I'm speaking materially, because it is the place chosen for the love of God. Today, I can say of Rome what the prophet said of Jerusalem: once rightness lodged in her, and her princes were princes of peace. Now she has turned to dross and her princes have become murderers. Birgitta retrieves here the words of the prophet Jesaja's strong condemnation of Jerusalem. See how the faithful city, she has become a prostitute. She once was full of justice. Rightness used to dwell in her, but now murderers. In Birgitta's vocabulary, however, like Petrarch's and Kola's apocalyptic configurations, the condemnation of Jerusalem transforms into the blaming of Rome. Kola's and Petrarch's depiction of the suffering of Rome, widowed, also have much in common with Birgitta's desperate cry in the following, that soon follows. Oh Rome, if you knew your days, you would surely weep and not rejoice. I don't need to read the entire quotation, but my point is simply that along with Dante, Petrarch, and other intellectual figures of the Italian Trecento, Birgitta came to establish herself as one of the main defenders of Rome. She worked eagerly for the restoration of the Ecclesia Romana. Likewise, few were more keen in their attempt to convince the Pope and the Emperor to return to Italy. And as you certainly are well aware of, this ardent justification of Rome as the caput mundi came to be decisive for the following century and the rise of the powerful popes in Renaissance Italy. Let me just conclude with stressing the figure of the widowed Rome, how the figure of the widowed Rome was, in Birgitta's context, realized on several levels. She did not only employ the figure rhetorically in the particular letter we just have read. From the picture of Birgitta painted by the sources, it is easy to imagine her love for Rome. According to several witnesses during her canonization process, she had become a familiar face in the city. Every day, in all kinds of weather, this energetic woman would run along the streets and into the churches and the many holy shrines of Rome. She visited the hospitals to care for patients, and she helped the poor, sometimes by begging in the streets herself, since she had handed over all her belongings to her father confessor, Magister Peter, in accordance with her vow of poverty. As such, I cannot resist the temptation of thinking of her as a woman who came to incarnate the topos of the widowed Rome. She embodied the widow in persona as the elderly woman dressed in black who became such a common sight in the streets of Rome. Yes, perhaps it is even Birgitta we can see in this illustration of Fazio degli Uberti's long didactic poem Ditamondo from the mid-14th century, in which Roma Vidua is such a central figure. I love this. There's the Pope and the Emperor outside of the walls and looking over the walls, and Rome, the widowed Rome, which is very similar to Birgitta. But then I just want to add some very few, if I still have some little time, about the project with Birgitta's legacy. So a tendency within modern scholarship has been to study Birgitta solely within the tradition of holy women in late medieval accounts of European, in late medieval culture. As such, she has been more or less excluded from accounts of European intellectual history, the development of Italian humanists, and the surge of women writers in the Renaissance. Her revelations, however, reveals an extraordinary social network of correspondence, knights and friars, popes and cardinals, and noble families such as the Visconti in Milan, the Colonna in Rome, Queen Joanna of Naples, and Queen Eleanor of Aragon in Cyprus. This network places Birgitta in the center of the urban and the courtly context emerging at the threshold of the Italian Renaissance. Likewise, the notions that occupied her, such as the role of the church, the reformation of the clergy, the secular power of the church, the bloody wars among the Italian city-states, the providential role of the Virgin Mary, and the suffering of Christ, clearly connects her to the future generations, I would say, of reformers in the 15th and the 16th century. This impact of Birgitta's legacy and writings in Renaissance and Reformation Italy has yet to be fully explored, and there is still much to be done, to be revealed. What we know though, is that her revelations were copied and translated and later printed in anthologies or alone. We have, in fact, 9 printed editions of her complete revelations, the 8 books, from the end of the 14th century to the early 17th century. So, throughout this period, copies of her writings, both in manuscript and prints, were circulated up and down the Italian peninsula. And this is something that we want to really to dive into and to explore. So, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Un, for the very rich paper that you've given. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Anna Wainwright. She's currently a PhD candidate in Italian Studies at NYU, and we're all very happy that beginning in the fall, she will be Assistant Professor of Italian at University of New Hampshire. She has published on Isabella Cervoni's oration to Pope Clement VIII, and has also translated Leonora Bernardi's untitled pastoral tragicomedy, which is going to be published soon next year in 2018 with the Other Voices series, and translation for which Virginia Cox and Lisa Sampson did the introduction and notes. So we're all looking forward to that as well. And she currently serves as the editorial assistant for Dante Studies and the social media liaison for the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women.
Well, thank you so much, Aileen, and thank you, Un, for that wonderful paper and presentation of our project. And thank you, Virginia, for organizing this wonderful conference that allows me to listen to everyone talk about Colonna for 2 days. And thank you to Alice also, who's just done an amazing job organizing everything. So, following Un's wonderful paper, my paper today is sort of our project adjacent, because I'll be talking today about Vittoria Colonna's public function, or really more her public use, as a celebrity widow, in poetry written by others and published both during her lifetime and after her death, and at the way varied representations of Colonna by other poets contributed to the creation of her public persona, not just as a woman and poet, but as a model for the ideal way to demonstrate one's grief for a husband in the public sphere. Most famously, of course, and I'm sorry, but I will stay on Canto 37 for a couple of minutes, which we all know so well. Most famously, of course, Ariosto begins Canto 37 of his final iteration of the Orlando Furioso by singling out Colonna as the ideal widow, praising her poetic immortalization of her husband as so exemplary that she has surpassed even the classical paragon Artemisia, who drank her husband's ashes and built him a magnificent funeral monument. My paper today does 2 things. First, I will consider the establishment of Colonna as a new kind of celebrity widow. In the years following her husband Francesco Ferrante d'Avalos's death in 1525, by thinking about Ariosto's praise of Colonna in concert with the action in the body of the much-discussed Canto 37, which might very well be deemed the Canto of Widowhood. Second, I will look at the after-effects of that celebrity by examining a second poetic deployment of Colonna as an exemplary widow poet by the late 16th century poet Francesca Turina in her own widowed verse. She so dearly loved her husband that on his death she left half her heart with him, so to speak, enshrining her feelings for all the world to see. So writes the 14th century, or 15th rather, century widow Christine de Pizan in the Book of the City of the Ladies of the legendary queen Artemisia of Caria, who honored her husband King Mausolus after his death by the daily drinking of his ashes, so that the remains of the person she had loved so deeply should not have any other sepulchre than that of the heart and body in which this love had first taken root. In addition to making her own body a living tomb for her husband's, a monument in flesh, Artemisia erected an architectural marvel in his honor, a monument so spectacular that henceforth all burial buildings were called mausoleums after his. Throughout the Renaissance, exemplary widows like Artemisia provided a select way to think about the relationship between a woman's widowhood and the broader community, both for widows themselves and for society at large. To be plunged into an entirely new category of identity upon the death of one's husband was to be turned into a very specific kind of person, with associated expectations, anxieties, and responsibilities to one's dead husband, to one's community, and to God. While a widow's societal position was in some ways tenuous, to a great degree, her role had already been fleshed out and was being performed all around her through a continual and collective reading and rewriting of classical and biblical models. The exemplum of Virgil's particular version of Dido reminded widows to hold fast to their husbands' memories and to avoid the temptations of foreigners who might wash up on their shores. The Old Testament's Judith provided a model of a widow who served her political community through a well-placed act of violence and the use of her womanly charms. In the New Testament, Luke's Anna of Phanuel provided a model of piety and devotion to God. Countless other examples of virtuous women offered further reminders of the importance of chastity and loyalty, reinforcing St. Paul's assertion that the true widow must commit to a life of spiritual and civic devotion, virtuous and faithful to her husband's memory, while continuing to serve the larger community of which she was still a living member. With the development of purgatory in the Middle Ages, Christian widows became responsible as well for praying their husbands into heaven, a responsibility of which Dante's pilgrim is consistently reminded as he makes his way up the mountain of purgatory, and his interlocutors alternately lament and praise their widows' devotional labors on earth. Amidst all of these many models Renaissance widows had to follow, after Colonna, there was also Colonna. As Virginia Cox demonstrates in her essay, The Exemplary Vittoria Colonna, in the New Brill Companion, Colonna became, in the 16th century, an exemplum herself, an identity she consciously cultivated and referenced in her own poetry. Colonna's role as an exemplary widow in the work of other writers, and how a carefully cultivated ideal of hers as the ideal combination of grief and poetry that endured across the 16th century, is of particular interest to me today. The prevalence of exemplary widows in the Renaissance and Colonna's incorporation into this pantheon is, I would like to suggest, symptomatic of the deep underlying societal anxiety about the alarming freedom some widows enjoyed after the deaths of their husbands, and even the civic consequences of stereotypical widowly grief, coming back to that hair-pulling, widow wailing and screeching, which, if left unchecked, might wreak havoc on the broader community of a city. This long-standing anxiety is perhaps illustrated best at the end of Petrarch's famous letter, How a Ruler Ought to Govern His State, when he beseeches Francesco Wanda Carrara, Lord of Padua, to move any ostentatiously weeping women in the streets indoors, lest they cause the community to believe that here was a madman on the loose, or that the city was under enemy attack. Order that wailing women should not be permitted to step outside their homes, he urges, and if some lamentation is necessary to the grieved, let them do it at home, and do not let them disturb the public thoroughfares. Petrarch echoes the deep anxiety felt among civic leaders about how women grieved in public as early as the Trecento. In Renaissance Florence, women were often excluded from public mourning rituals, even when the dead were their own husbands. In some cities, this exclusion was codified into law. The dramatic and public way in which women were expected to mourn, as Sharon Strokia has explained, was viewed as dangerous and might lead to violence, vendetta, or other breaches of civic order and decorum if performed publicly in front of other citizens. Colonna's mourning poetry, then, offered in many ways a solution for how to contain widowed grief, as well as to showcase it. The poet had been widowed 7 years when Ariosto published his final edition of his poem in 1532, to which, thanks to the artful maneuverings of her relative Alfonso d'Avalos, he added his praise of her. In his encomium, Ariosto explains that Colonna's greatness as a woman and a poet lies not just in her devotion to her husband, but in her innovative manner of grieving after her husband's death. Through her poetry, she has drawn her husband from the grave, trarlo il sepolcro, rather than simply letting him lie in it, besting even Artemisia's monumental salute. And I do think that this portrait is actually also having a moment, as well as Colonna. It is on our program, and it is quite wonderful. It is this action specifically that he points to 3 times in his 4-octave description of her. First with trarlo il sepolcro, she is even greater than Artemisia because rather than por sotterra un uom, put a man in the ground, she has pulled him out of it, trarlo di sopra. Finally, she has pulled him di lete del rio che 9 volte l'ombre circonda, tratto il suo consorte. Hers is a rescue operation more than anything else, and certainly not a burial. Ariosto thus posits Colonna from the beginning of 37 as the ideal exemplary widow because of this honorable, productive way of grieving her husband's death, before launching his readers, as Albert Askeley notes in his masterful reading of gender tensions and gender envy in the canto, into the story of a nightmare version of exemplarity gone terribly wrong. The bloody widow Drusilla, whose tale takes up the rest of Canto 37, is generally acknowledged to be based on the exemplary widow Kama, a rather late addition to the canon of Renaissance widowly exemplarity, appearing just 50 years before Colonna herself became a widow. Kama's story originates in Plutarch's Virtues of Women, published in Latin for the first time in 1475. She is a loyal wife, a woman both of transcendent beauty and great wisdom. A political colleague of her husband, Cinerix, pursues Kama. She denies his advances, so he kills her husband. Grief-stricken, Kama retires to Diana's temple, determined never to marry again. Cinerix pursues her still. She rejects him a number of times, but is eventually worn down by family pressure to marry her. Artfully concealing her hatred, Kama smiles and pretends to comply, but secretly laces a celebratory wedding drink with poison, from which both she and her enemy drink. She then reveals what she has done, cries out to her dead husband that she will join him in the afterlife, and dies alongside her tormentor. As Letizia Panizza has shown, the Kama story was taken up by a number of different authors in the 16th century, and here we have a lovely, lush illustration of it, which I'd like to talk about in a minute. Taken up by a number of different authors in the 16th century, mostly as an example of straightforward widowly devotion. Ariosto's version of Kama, however, is markedly different from all the others. He breaks with tradition and moves Kama from the Greco-Roman period to the Middle Ages. She is now the Christian wife of a medieval knight and has been renamed Drusilla. In his rendition of the tale, the beautiful young woman comes to the tyrant Marganore's court with her husband, Olindro. Marganore's son Tenacro, taken with Drusilla's charms, kills Olindro so that he can have Drusilla for himself. Unlike Plutarch's heroine, Ariosto's version of Kama is trapped in her oppressor's kingdom after her husband's murder, a foreigner in a strange and threatening land. Her first impulse is to die alongside him, and she begs Tenacro to finish her off as well. When he refuses, she tries to kill herself by throwing herself over a ravine, but she survives and is faced with the chilling fate of marrying her husband's killer. Determined not to, and desperate for death, she hides her true feelings of grief inside, concocting a plan more complex than the original Kamas, and into which the stories of numerous other exemplary widows bleed. Capitalizing on her identity as a foreign woman, she tells her captor that she will marry him, but that in her homeland, widows and their betrothed must first pay a special tribute to their dead husbands. On the day they are to marry, Drusilla orchestrates an elaborate and entirely made-up ritual at the church, in which the body of her dead husband is placed on the altar, and she and Tenacro both drink from a poisoned chalice in front of his family, his tyrant father, and the assembled citizens of the kingdom. And this, I just did want to point out that this image of Kama has many people there, but in the Plutarch, they're always alone, but Ariosto does add people. Once they have both imbibed, Drusilla reveals her crime and calls out to her dead husband that she has avenged him before she collapses in death alongside Tenacro, a smile on her face. Whereas each Renaissance retelling of Kama's tale prior to her reincarnation as Ariosto's Drusilla ends with her triumphant descent to the underworld to join her husband, here her death is of course only the beginning of the story. Marganore, overcome with grief over his son's shocking murder, brutally attacks and defiles Drusilla's lifeless body, kills an additional 30 women in the church who are there to witness the wedding, and wounds 100 more. The community at large is witness to her violent revenge and to her body's destruction, and also suffers the violent consequences of her grief and her private vendetta. After inflicting his violence on the church group, Marganore codifies his anger into written law, inscribing it on a column in the center of his kingdom, and segregates society, exiling all women to a dismal village on the outskirts of the kingdom. He also legislates specifically against foreign women, like Drusilla, who become subject to beating with willow reeds and are prohibited from wearing clothes below the waist, so as to shamefully expose their sex to all who pass by. The horrific civic consequences of Drusilla's revenge are only reversed when the two female knights, Ariosto's heroines, Marfisa and Bradamante, defeat Marganore and liberate the realm from his rule. after they happen upon the horrific misogynistic regime on their travels. Their defeat of the tyrant is remarkably quick. As Alyssa Weaver has pointed out, it takes only an octave and one puño from Marfisa to take down the man who has made life hell for so many women. After the liberation, the knights bury Drusilla and her husband together in a lavish tomb befitting their love and devotion, and triumphantly rewrite the law of the land on Marganore's column, turning it into a monument celebrating their victory, in a clear play on Colonna's triumphant and architecturally convenient name. The column, as Ascoli has elaborated, thus goes from a symbol of a phallocentric order to a gynocentric one. Rather than having rectified the situation by establishing a society in which men and women are equals, however, Bradamante and Marfisa's actions simply flip the oppressive imbalance, making an oppressive matriarchy out of what was once an oppressive patriarchy. Though the story of Drusilla retains the basic skeleton of Plutarch's tale, the Kama story is thus transformed, shifting from the tale of a private widow's cunning actions to one of political revenge. That Drusilla casts herself as a foreign widow with unknown customs, furthermore, does more than simply differentiate her from traditional depictions of Kama. It also implicitly aligns her with a subset of widows who use their foreignness to advance a political and sometimes deceptive cause. Among many others, the story Drusilla spins does not recall Plutarch's account of Kama, but instead Justin's pre-Virgilian account of Dido, who escaped a forced marriage by leaning on her identity as a widow, pretending to perform an obscure ritual before she could remarry to appease the spirit of her dead husband before killing herself in heroic fashion. Ariosto's tale thus pushes out, with strands of numerous widows contaminating the Kama story. Drusilla is also, to a degree, an Artemisia, imbibing a substance that brings her closer to her husband. In many versions of the Artemisia tale, she eventually succumbs to death after drinking the ashes, her widowly devotion slowly poisoning her. For widows historically, the act of suicide implies not only self-sacrifice, but a noble desire to rejoin one's dead husband. That elements of numerous exemplary widows glimmer in Drusilla suggests that she is not just the continuation of these figures, who were so consistently represented in art and literature of the time, but an amalgam of examples that have been borrowed and made new, if deadly, a metastasis, if you will, incorporating multiple figures in one to explore the ways in which widowhood could, if not properly contained, affect the community in a damaging way. That Ariosto throws his weight behind Colonna positions Drusilla not as a heroic, exemplary widow like Kama, but as its antithesis, a widow who uses the wrong tools to memorialize her husband and protect herself from the dangers that widows inevitably face, even those as privileged as Colonna, and provoking chaos in the process. If Colonna has been made, by herself and others, the new exemplum of widowhood, firm, powerful, devoted, and chaste, who channels her unbearable grief not into violence and vendetta, but into the decorous art of poetry, pulling her husband out of the grave rather than leaving him there. She has also swept away the old model, the die-by-the-sword class of widows for whom the only escape from remarriage was often death, and has constructed a new one, inscribing new laws, as it were, into her poems. Drusilla abandons her body and that of her husband when she dies, and Marganore destroys it, but Colonna's body remains ever intact in Ariosto. Through Canto 37, Ariosto offers not just the rehearsal of a classical example, but a new and multi-layered model of safe widowhood. Colonna's model grief is thus forever tied to the potential chaos of widowly grief gone wrong. And certainly in light of Remy Targoff's talk this morning, this is particularly interesting because, of course, Colonna herself, in both poems and in letters, was representing in many ways a very chaotic and messy widowly grief that was very bodily as well. But it is quite interesting that that doesn't enter in at all to Ariosto's depiction of her here. So as has been much explored by many, including Cox Rabiti, and as Virginia actually mentioned this morning, Colonna's work was, of course, remarkably generative for numerous female poets in the years of the Counter-Reformation. As a celebrity widow, Colonna's own particular alchemic blend of style and grief was a particularly profound influence on widowed poets, especially in the second half of the 16th century, and the use of her as an anchor for how widows should behave is visible in multiple ways. We can see this perhaps most clearly in the writings of the poet Francesca Turina, who married Count Giulio Buffalini when she was 21 and he was 70, and who was widowed within 10 years. In 1595, when she had been a widow almost already a decade, and this is her in a lovely old widow portrait, which is basically impossible to acquire a good image of, but it is still in her house in a wonderful form. In 1595, when she had been a widow already a decade, Turina published a collection of spiritual poems, Rime spirituali sopra I misteri del Santissimo Rosario, and dedicated them to the Tuscan Pope Clement VIII. Turina had a strategic reason for writing. She was in desperate need of the Pope's intervention in a property war with her husband's children from a previous marriage. And this is an interesting moment when we see poetry doing really specific social public work in the world. In the introductory letter to the collection, she presents herself to the Pope as a poor vedovetta, or little widow, an abject figure in dire need of patronage and material assistance for herself and her children. She offers the Pope the poem cycle in the hope that he will take pity on her, reminding him that, as a woman, she cannot protect her land as a man could, con le fatiche e col sangue, with physical labor and blood, but is only able to defend herself con la sincerità dell'affetto e con la devozione dell'inchiostro, with the sincerity of her emotions and with devotion expressed in ink. At the end of the work, Turina showcases the central focus of these emotions, as well as their sincerity, through a collection of 24 poems lamenting her widowhood, entitled In morte dell'illustrissimo signor Giulio Buffalini, suo consorte. The cycle is a pointed reminder to the Pope and her readers that Turina's is a dual identity. She is a poet, but she is also a devoted widow, who is alone, grieving, and in need of pastoral aid. At the conclusion of the canzoniere, a new figure is introduced, with a madrigal addressed not to her husband, nor to her dedicatee, the Pope, but instead to Vittoria Colonna. Porti Vittoria il vanto di stil, non di dolore, che della vena onde si strugge il core, l'arte o minor, ma non minore il pianto. Tu chiamasti Parnaso, e ti rispose al suon di dotte angeliche parole, con rime alte e famose, adornandogli il ciel del tuo bel sole. Misera, io piango, e male pindo ascolta il mio dire semplice e frale, che io crederei, se uguale fosse il mio stile alla pietà e al zelo, ornar anch'io d'un nuovo sole e cielo. It may surprise no one in the audience here today that Turina chose to reference Colonna in this series of poems dedicated to her dead husband, though it may have come as a bit of a surprise when readers turn to the last page of this publication. It is, of course, a recognition of Colonna's overwhelming influence, which is palpable throughout the series of poems through both vocabulary and theme. In the Counter-Reformation, poems expressing grief for one's beloved husband are automatically associated with Colonna's earlier poetic project. And yet the choice to name-check Colonna also serves to offer a highly conscious departure. Turina here throws down the gauntlet, so to speak, declaring, probably disingenuously, that while she may never have Colonna's great poetic talent, her grief stands unmatched. As I'm sure everyone here today will probably recognize, Turina's poem is also a direct response to the famous opening sonnet of Colonna's Rime amorose, Scrivo sol per sfogar l'interna doglia, and the vocabulary is distinctly Colonna. And yet, as Cox has observed, this poem is also pointedly different. It is a madrigal, not a sonnet, in a poem expressly devoted to the dyad of style and grief, for which Colonna is still so very famous. In Colonna's much-discussed sonnet, her words also privilege grief over style. She declares that she writes only to expiate the terrible grief she feels, and not in order to shed light on her husband, whom she will of course describe repeatedly throughout her work as her sole. She is lamenting for just cause, or justa cagion, thus establishing from the outset what Maria Serena Sapegno calls a legitimate ethic for her poetry dedicated to Davalos. The glorification of her husband, she declares, should be left to altra voce e più sagge parole. Colonna can offer only her pura fe, ardor, and intensa pena as an excuse for her grave lament, which neither time nor reason can temper. The final terzina punctuates the sonnet with her entirely dissimulative reiteration that she is not the right writer for the memorialization project her beloved husband deserves. Her words are not the sweet song necessary to bring him eternal fame, but are instead base and unproductive bitter weeping. Her voice is not serene, but filled with dark sighs. Her verses have no style, but only grief. Her readers, of course, have been in on the joke from the very first line. As Abigail Brundon has observed, Colonna is asking her audience to collude with her in this poem by proclaiming her lack of style in the highest Petrarchan and also Dantean language, interlacing her protestations of being no more than a pitiable widow who writes only to relieve her grief with a poetic mastery and elegance few might hope to emulate. In Turina's madrigal, she refutes Colonna's claim. Sure, it's Colonna who is the mistress of poetic style, archiving her grief in a monument of verse, but Turina's grief is greater. Sitting just below the surface of the poem is Turina's offer to her own readers to collude with her, suggesting that she may try to overtake her model stylistically as well, becoming a new Colonna for her own age. What makes Turina's madrigal especially noteworthy for our purposes is the overall pursuit of this published work, an intentionally public and published performance of her grief. Colonna's legacy is here used as cultural capital in order to achieve a targeted goal, socio-political help from the Pope. From the dedicatory letter onward, Turina presents herself, as Francesco Giusti has noted, as a widow in danger, alone, vulnerable, in need of help from male figures of authority. But I would venture to add that she also offers something more. For one, the promise of the glory poetry by a new Colonna can bring to the Pope Clement VIII. But Turina also offers a threat. If she does not get her way through poetry, she may morph from grieving poet to grieving woman, going from Vittoria to Drusilla, unleashing her woe on the world around her, as both Petrarch and Ariosto feared widows might. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. So I mean, Boccaccio is, of course, the great proponent of the pre-Virgilian Dido and is really indignant and outraged that she was so slandered by Virgil. So I think that this is very interesting in terms of something that I've already been thinking about a lot at this conference, in terms of Colonna as we perceive her, or as she was perceived in the 16th century, or at least described as this figure that didn't resort to suicide, that didn't resort to what nearly all exemplary widows tended to do, which was kill themselves rather than marry again, or rather than be sexually vulnerable in some way. And as many in this room have discussed, I think Colonna clearly used her widowhood as a way to fend off sexual threat, to fend off remarriage that people wanted her to have, and created a sort of force field around herself so that she didn't have to do any of those things. But I am really intrigued, and Remy Targoff and I were speaking about this earlier, there's this sort of disconnect between how she's represented and how, in fact, she expressed herself in her own poetry and in letters, and this sort of question of desolation and desperation that she clearly felt, in fact, has quite a lot in common with certain exemplary widows who threw themselves off things or imbibed things or stabbed themselves.
Great, thank you, Anna, and Un both for your beautiful talks. My question is directed to Anna, and I wanted to pick up on the really, really productive discussion you brought up of this idea of social anxiety around widows. And I was wondering to what degree that may or may not relate in the reception of Vittoria Colonna to anxiety about the spiritual and reform nature of her poems in the later 16th century. I was curious whether Turina herself picks up on the more spiritual aspects of Colonna's poetry, or if in fact perhaps she seeks to avoid those, particularly because of the Counter-Reformation sense of this period.
Well, I think that's really, I mean, it's of course very interesting. I don't think it's an accident by any means that her poem cycle to her husband comes at the end of a Rime Spirituali, dedicated to a pope. So there is, of course, a mix of spiritual poetry and widowly poetry in an edition dedicated to a pope for political gain. So there is, of course, that element, which I think is very interesting. But I am also quite interested in this sort of post-reform, so counter-reformation interest in her widow poetry, and especially in her amorous verse. And yes, I mean, the one reference in this to her, she name checks her when it is the poetry dedicated to her husband very specifically. So I think there is this sort of careful allusion through just mentioning her at all in an edition that is in fact entitled the Rime Spirituali, I mean, we're all, right. But then, of course, she kind of, again, keeps her contained in the widowed verse at the end, which I think is an interesting conscious choice.
Grazie, parlo brevemente. A proposito di tutte queste vedove, è interessante perché la cosa che mi verrebbe da dire prima di tutto è che è verissimo quello che stava dicendo in questo momento Anne, cioè che Vittoria, diciamo, sceglie di rimanere vedova perché è di gran lunga la condizione migliore che una donna possa vivere,
sì.
e quindi è l'unico spazio di libertà e quindi naturalmente se lo tiene. Però non rimane vedova, nel senso che va molto oltre, cioè quello di cui noi stiamo parlando poi successivamente, dopo aver attraversato quello che lei stessa considera un passaggio fondamentale dal punto di vista creativo, no? Cioè quindi la poesia d'amore come passaggio fondamentale che rimane e però la conduce a un'altra cosa, no? E quindi diciamo da una parte mi interessa quello che stavi dicendo te, cioè che in un certo senso viene ricondotta alla vedovanza, rischiacciata sulla vedovanza nella Controriforma, e questo sarebbe molto interessante anche da capire, no? Perché non è più possibile usarla come modello di poesia religiosa, perché quella è molto pericolosa, quella non si fa, infatti lei è pericolosa. Invece la vedova che piange, quello va benissimo, no? E l'incapacità da parte di queste donne vedove, no? Cioè la chiarezza che non vogliono risposarsi, questo mi pare evidente, però anche la difficoltà, perché lei stessa, noi sappiamo, no? Lei stessa gode di una posizione di straordinaria libertà, e però poi fino a un certo punto, guarda le cose come vive a Viterbo, no? Come gli ultimi anni della sua vita sono anni di una dipendenza totale, no? Eppure una delle donne più potenti dell'Occidente ed ha il massimo di libertà. Quindi mi sembra molto interessante il fatto che state un po' dicendo, no? Questa figura così importante della vedova, che però viene via via spogliata, ovviamente per i motivi dell'ansietà di cui dicevi, di tutti gli elementi di libertà e di forza, per divenire invece soltanto un'icona di virtù, diciamo così, no? La castità, la religiosità, eccetera. E forse mi chiedo se invece le donne, siccome è di questo che stiamo parlando, le donne che la leggono, che la citano, che la assumono come modello, percepiscono anche tutto quest'altro versante, che non è un versante invece di vulnerabilità, di fragilità e anche di conformismo, no? Se vogliamo. Cioè, invece mi sembra, nonostante la lettura che ne abbiamo avuta, mi sembra difficile pensare a Vittoria Colonna come una conformista. Mi sembra una donna molto anticonformista. E mi chiedo quanto questo sia passato nella modellizzazione. Questa era la domanda.
Sì, no, grazie mille, questo mi ha dato tantissimo. Sì, davvero, assolutamente. Sì, certamente all'inizio si viene chiaramente ricondotta la vedovanza con Colonna a questa, sì, la conduce subito a Dio, subito a Paul, subito a tutte queste altre cose, sì, durante gli anni 40, ma anche nel caso di Turina io credo sì, assolutamente, anche che lei non è assolutamente una conformista, quindi io direi che anche Turina prende anche questo modello, il modello di Colonna, davvero come una maniera per trasformarsi anche un po', io direi anche assolutamente alla fine di questa pubblicazione molto, molto strana, anche interessante al Papa, e questo è stato anche era un periodo molto interessante anche per il Papa Clemente VIII, anche perché lui voleva davvero creare una nuova Roma, anche sì, una città della cultura, dell'arte, tutto questo, però anche lei sapeva anche questo quando ha scritto questo, sì. Quindi pensavo anche di questo, pensavo anche dei sonetti che ha scritto Colonna al Papa, anche che pensava anche di questo, io credo, sì. Quindi ci sono tantissimi diversi elementi a cui pensava in questo, però no, grazie mille.
So I had a question for our first speaker. And I was wondering if we... so I was just wondering if she ever makes the obvious move of talking about Roma Vedova as Virgin Mary and as ecclesia, because there is a kind of interesting parallel in the citation that you had from the Anonimo Romano, right, of this fresco of, you know, Carthage and all of these other great cities, and women's bodies that have gone down with the ship, and, you know, Carthage is down there, and it's a sign that we, Rome, might finish in that same fate if we don't, you know, take care of this woman, of this idea. In the middle of the 14th century, that fresco probably would have been glossed against the famous Navicella image in the courtyard of St. Peter's, which was about, you know, it's Christ at the moment of calming the storm, and it's about, you know, Rome as ship of church. And this seems to me a kind of interesting, you know, I don't want to invoke the word secular, but a kind of, you know, a parallel to this that is going in a slightly different direction. And it raises the question for me of how the idea of Roma as personification maps or does not map onto Ecclesia / Virgin Mary for Bridget.
That was much. Yeah. I'm not sure if I understood your question.
Well, I mean, I guess it's sort of two parts. It's one,
yeah.
Is Vedova ever then linked to Ecclesia and Virgin?
In Birgitta's text. Well, let me please start with this Navicella di Giotto. That is absolutely one of the main sources for the Anonimo Romanos, or the propaganda pictures, because this is propaganda iconography in Rome, political iconography. The ship is based absolutely on a Navicella di Giotto, which has disappeared also. My simple point is that this rhetoric, which is an old rhetoric, of course, this bride and the virgin. She's not using the virgin as the church, it's suddenly turned into a very political metaphor. It's exploded. It's political, and it really doesn't start before the middle of the 14th century. Before that, you didn't have this extraordinary will to raise Rome again. Mm-hmm. So it was extremely politically connected to Rome for the first time, in a way, when the Pope and the Emperor were away. So it suddenly, the rhetoric really transformed into become a very strongly defense of Rome and of Ecclesia Romana. And for Birgitta, it's of course Rome and the church belong together.
Yeah, I mean, it might be that one is just so subsumed into the other that you don't need to articulate it for her. But it seems kind of, I mean, to me, it would seem like a very obvious move to then say, you know, Rome is this virgin, and the thing that differentiates her from every other, you know, city that has wept, Jerusalem and everything else, is like, she's also ecclesia.
Yes, absolutely. That is part of the rhetoric. That is what was waiting. That is what was waiting for Rome. Yeah. If we did not react in a way, which is with Carthage and Jerusalem and Babylon and Troya. So that was what is important with this, what Birgitta is doing exactly at the same time as Petrarch. She's using this restoration of Rome as in a biblical or within a Christian framework. For Petrarch, it's of course mostly the revival of the classical tradition of the Republic, but they are really in the apocalyptic program of the Franciscans and of the Coladrienzo. Those two aspects are really connected to each other. And her descriptions of Rome as Rome in ruins are so very similar that you find in the Petrarch's letters, which is exactly, they were both in Rome in the 1350s.
I have a question for Anna, following up a bit on Serena's point. I was thinking about, I can't remember what sonnet, and anyway, the numbers of the sonnets doesn't mean anything, but one of the sonnets that in Bullock is in the late 60s or 70s or so, ends with Vittoria saying that she's kind of sick of performing the widow's rites and wants to devote herself to migliore opere. And depending on how we want to understand migliore, I mean, it's interesting she uses works, which has obviously a Catholic suggestion and not Protestant. But the sense, as Serena, I think, was also suggesting that that for Vittoria Colonna, being a widow was a phase which she went through and came out sort of on the other side. Yeah. And I was thinking about her praising Costanza d'Avalos Piccolomini, who actually left her husband living to go live in the nunnery. In other words, one didn't even need to be a widow to make that kind of choice. So there's a way in which the widow as vocation is one that is, I think, rejected by Colonna. And as Serena was also suggesting, obviously, you know, the move to Reform, Protestant, however we want to put it, was not palatable in the Counter-Reformation. Right. But I'm just wondering how much her role as widow you think is sort of being instrumentalized in the second half of the century. I mean, that they're going back to something that she herself, already by 1541, the frontispiece is of a religious woman. I mean, she has really shed that. It was a vehicle to get somewhere else. But your talk very suggestively makes me think that there was a kind of recuperation or reassignation of her that way, which is in tension with her own, with the traces she leaves about her feelings towards it.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for asking that, because I think one thing in choosing to do this talk that's specifically about other people's perceptions of her is I'm really trying to, the reality is that, of course, Colonna's relationship, I think, to her own widowhood and self-presentation was much more complex than how she was appropriated. And she was appropriated however people wanted her to be, which is how she became really more of a persona than anything else, I think. But what's interesting in terms of, absolutely right, what Maria Serena was saying was that this, like, being reconducted, that her widowhood is this sort of, you know, convenient 13-year period, and then she moves on. I think it's interesting because in the Counter-Reformation, of course, the church really was very pro-widow and did not want people to remarry. But there are many texts in the 1570s especially that talks exactly about this kind of idea of widowhood as a temporary space in which women can sort of prepare themselves, but for second marriage. So these are secular treatises, and it's a quite interesting, weird little subgenre of conduct literature in the 1570s that talks about widowhood as a space, and lo stato vidovile as this sort of almost purgatorial space, of course, where you're kind of waiting, and but you're going to have intellectual development of some kind. But of course, it's used. Most of these people are lawyers, rather, who are writing against the church, really. And so there's this kind of tension, and in one dialogue, a woman is sort of presented on the eve of her second marriage as having really quite enjoyed her state of widowhood, but now for the good of her family and the good of her city, which is obviously exactly what Colonna didn't do, for the good of her family and the good of her city, she's going to get remarried again. So I think that, in fact, what Colonna was doing, or the way she sort of treated her widowhood as this almost, prep school for her spiritual life, I think that was actually reappropriated in a secular way, whereas then there were, of course, widows like Turina, who you could almost categorize as melancholic, who just kept going. I mean, Turina, 50 years after her husband dies, is still writing poems about it. She doesn't give up. So there's an interesting tension there.
I just wanted to take a moment with this amazing poem, because I'm really interested in the choice of praise, because it seems so half-hearted.
No. Yeah, it's
She's
really
saying,
not praise.
I mean, and what is this stile? Is it actually a good thing? And the words that she uses to praise her, that she is, well, Angelica is probably the only one that works, but dotto, rime alte, famose, these are all really problematic if you think about the context of the late century, where the whole point is that the spiritual poem must be affective and felt and act upon the reader and not be too stylish. I don't know, so it seems to me a really, really nice example of kind of a really problematic response to a role model that you might have more to say about.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of rude. Yeah. No, I mean, Yeah, I mean, I think it's very tongue-in-cheek, and it's a really interesting. I find it quite interesting that it's the final poem because in some ways, it's punctuating the whole thing, and this wonderful 24-poem sequence to her husband is sort of startling to come across this as the last poem. Like, what a strange resolution. And I think it is saying, in fact, I'm going to do better, and I will do better. And Virginia has this poem in her lyric anthology, and she points out that, of course, part of even choosing the madrigal, but this poem really serves to differentiate also Turina's style from Colonna's, they are very, very different styles. But then she scatters it, and I actually highlighted words that you'll all notice anyway, but I neglected to highlight sole, but she's scattering Colonna's vocab through it, but it's very interesting, both stylistically and then also just in terms of this, there is this real tongue-in-cheek tone to it.
But she couldn't be rejecting her because
Right.
she's still so important.
Right. No, I don't think she's rejecting. I think it's more.
So it's quite a dangerous game, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
I think it's really, I think it's really sort of anxiety about your role model and how you're going to differentiate yourself in this genre that's already been done to perfection in this way. And so you're trying to, both use her as capital, especially in the context. I mean, this is writing to a pope. She's trying to ingratiate herself, and she's trying to create a relationship with this pope. So it is really dangerous, right? It's not a rejection, but there's this sort of I will surpass, but she doesn't say that, and she's still using the style grief, tension, and saying. I mean, it's very.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up on Avi's point and your reading of it, which I think is really interesting and slightly different from how I thought about it. But I think you're right. When you look at the penultimate line, Pietade and Zelo, you could hardly get two more kind of key counter-Reformation terms. And there's definitely kind of one-upmanship going on. And all I wanted to point out is the plot really thickens when you think that Turina actually had a kind of relationship of kind of clientelage with the Colonna family. She lived with them for a long time, and she was a kind of companion to the younger female members of the family. So, kind of go figure what exactly she's doing here.
And that was after this, too, so you do wonder what they were thinking.
I think she had an earlier stint
Oh,
with
really?
them, and then she returned to this very long period in the 17th century.
Real Rebecca situation.
But also, I would say that coming back to Serena's point, which I thought was really interesting as well. I mean, Turina has this complex relationship with Colonna here, but the other writer I was pointing to earlier, Maddalena Campiglia, who cites Colonna, she is citing her in a really different way as a kind of model of how a woman might choose to, through a fictional character in the play, how a woman might choose, instead of marriage, to devote herself to a career of writing. And it's almost as though she's just kind of eliding the fact that Colonna was a widow as opposed to someone who'd chosen never to marry. And she's also eliding the fact that she, Campiglia, in fact, did marry and then abandoned her husband and lived as a widow. So we've got kind of two pseudo-widows. Vittoria Colonna constructed as a pseudo-widow. Campiglia actually a pseudo-widow. It's
very interesting. And also the pseudo-widow thing, I think, is extremely important in terms of course, the original idea of Rome as widow and this danger. And it's even from the Lamentations, it's always quasi-Vidua, right? It's always this almost widow, but we've got to bring them back, right? If we bring them back, then we'll avoid that widowhood. So there's this sort of weird, I really liked what you were saying about it being a space that you don't even necessarily have to have a dead husband to be a widow.
I suppose if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking our speakers today.